Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Welcome everyone, and thanks again for downloading another episode of the podcast. Our guest today is John Tulloch, who was our last guest on the last two episodes when he discussed his service as a FOO, a Forward Observation Officer in Vietnam with the New Zealand Army. John is the author of several articles about the Vietnam War and Borneo. He also gives talks on these subjects to military, history groups and schools. Since retiring from the civil service in 2015, John has begun writing The Borneo Graveyard, 1941 to 1945. This is a product of 12 years of research. This is his first book and the subject of this podcast.
Borneo was the land of the headhunters, and it was a World War II graveyard for POWs, internees, locals, Javanese and Japanese. John's book follows the raising of 5 Royal Artillery Air Defence regiments in 1939, their deployment in late 1942 to Southeast Asia, their short campaign in the Netherlands, East Indies, and eventual captivity as POWs in Java and North Borneo. His account describes the invasion of Borneo and the subsequent 4 years of Japanese occupation, and depicts the sadistic treatment of Australian, British, Dutch and Indian POWs in the various camps in North Borneo at Jesselton, Sandakan, Ranau, Labuan and Batu Lintang. In addition to this, he takes into account the 3 death marches from Sandakan to Ranau. His account of the internees covers the men, women and children from all over Borneo interned in Batu Lintang. They experienced the unspeakable behaviour of the guards, and several internees were killed or massacred trying to escape the Japanese regime or gratuitously executed before liberation. In addition to this, the locals of Borneo suffered terribly, with torture, executions and massacres occurring throughout. Malnutrition, starvation and death were endemic. Tribes exacted their revenge and over 8,000 Japanese died during the withdrawals in Sabah. The secretive Z Force gathered intelligence, trained local guerrilla fighters who harassed and exacted a heavy toll on the Japanese. Finally, John covers the convalescence at Labuan of all the POWs, followed by the repatriation to the UK and the dreadful wall of silence experienced by so many of them when they got back home.
John, it's great to have you on the pod again. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book?
Yes, indeed. First of all, thank you for having me on. In 1999, I was doing one of my visits to JWIC, instructing, and my family came on afterwards to join me out there. And after JWIC, we then went across to Sabah and did the normal things, climbed the mountain, Turtle Island, Sepilok. And when we were in Sandakan, I picked up a magazine, and it talked about Australian POW camp in Sandakan, which had recently been opened up as a memorial park. I knew nothing about it. I had studied Southeast Asian history, and this was something I was totally and utterly unaware of. So we went and visited, and it had opened up 2 months earlier, and there's the memorial hall, and that took me 3 attempts to actually walk around in what I read, and I was absolutely appalled. And I learnt about the POW camps, Sandakan, Ranau, and the 3 death marches. When I got back to the UK, I looked further into it because it had mentioned there were British POWs. And I discovered that, or learned, that half of the British POWs were from my regiment, the Royal Artillery. The others were RAF or RAF-VR. There were no British POW survivors. They all died. Luckily, the Australians, they had 6 survivors. And because of those 6, we learned what on earth happened in Sandakan. If I put it into percentages, 99.75% of the POWs, Sandakan, Ranau, the death marches, died. There were only the 6 survivors. I then decided something had to be done.
So why do you think as a nation or in the forces, because I've never heard of it either, why did we not know anything about this?
From what I can make out, and having researched and read into it, Borneo was a bridesmaid in the Southeast Asian War against Japan. To the Japanese, it was a vital island. To Malaya Command, to the British out there, it was not vital at all. And the horror of what occurred out there, people did not want to know. The POWs, or the former POWs, were moved back to the UK. They were given orders of silence. And in my book, there is a copy of it. They had to sign. They were not allowed to speak, tell their parents, their wives, their friends, and certainly not the media. Now, my uncle, he was there, but he went up into the railway. He never ever spoke about it. And the reception back in the UK was such that, you've arrived, you look all bronzed, you look fat, you've filled out. What have you done during the war? You've had a nice time in a POW camp. That actually was the reaction by many people. A question was asked in Parliament by an MP, and the reply basically was, we're still searching for the POWs. The government knew that in British North Borneo, or today's Sabah, there were no British survivors.
The army that fought in Burma, the 14th Army, that was known as the Forgotten Army. Were these soldiers part of the 14th Army, or were they completely separate?
They were totally, utterly separate. In British North, the Sabah, they were gunners, all air defence, who initially actually were going to Basra. They're a desert uniform and all the rest of it. The first convoy was then diverted to Singapore, 6 heavy anti-aircraft and 35 light anti-aircraft. But the ship carrying all their equipment went to Basra. In Singapore, they had a massive ordnance depot. And so they were able to re-equip, redress into greens. And within 24 hours of arriving, they were in action. 6 heavy anti-aircraft. At the end of January, were sent over to Palembang in Sumatra, 3.5 with 2 batteries of 3.5. 3.5 remained in Singapore with 2 batteries from 6 heavy anti-aircraft. That regiment, 3.5, was basically decimated, and they became part of the Gunner 600 at Balalai Island in the Solomons. And the reason why 6 went to Palembang in Sumatra was that there was the airfields in Singapore were basically becoming inoperable due to Japanese bombing. So they moved across into the Netherlands, East Indies, so they could support Singapore from there. The other convoy with the other 3 regiments, they went to Batavia, today's Jakarta. They arrived there in their sand-coloured uniform. Some of them remained in that uniform throughout. They fought in the Dutch East Indies. That's where they went into captivity, and they became part of the Java Party, and RAF was a party of close to 900 men. And they're the ones that went to British North Borneo, initially to Jesselton.
I think it's interesting that that war in the Far East, as you alluded to, is relatively forgotten. I think for most people, it starts with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and ends with the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But within that, there's a huge bit of history there that's just not known about. For example, I can talk to people and they've never heard about the fall of Singapore, where a garrison of 85,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. And really, I would probably say from what I've read, the fall of Singapore brought up that myth of the invincible Japanese soldier who was the master of the jungle.
That is very true, but and the Japanese force was half the size of the force in Singapore. But what is not told is that the Tiger of Malaya, as he was nicknamed, the senior Japanese general, he had his primary division. The divisional commander went up to him and said, "My men are knackered. I cannot go any further. I need to withdraw back into Malaya and to regroup." He said, "You will attack, and if you don't, you're on the fastest aircraft back to Tokyo, and you know what will happen." People have a go at Percival. Percival signed the document of surrender. Percival did not want to surrender. He wanted to carry on fighting. But his generals did not. They said, our boys are knackered. And yet everything you read, the diaries and all the rest of it, gunners crying over their guns. Why are we surrendering? We've got all this ammunition. We want to carry on. The generals, and one of them, Gordon Bennett, the Australian, having told his boys to carry on fighting, then with a small group, got on a sampan and sailed across to Sumatra, then got down into Java, where the senior British general there said, "Get that man onto an aircraft back to Australia. I don't want him anywhere near us." The Australians were disgusted with that guy's behaviour.
His name became a bit of a byword for swearing, didn't it?
In
Gordon.
Australia, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Bloody Gordon Bennett.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think we have to remember. I think the British were still focused on Europe, weren't we? We were always focused on Europe after the North African campaign. The Far East wasn't close to home. D-Day was everything. When you read all the stories, if you watch all the films, they're mainly about the European campaign, not the tough campaign in Italy or the horrendously tough campaign in the Far East.
Yeah, but also, alluding to what John was saying about the Japanese soldiers being knackered, it wasn't until the battles of sort of Admin Box, Imphal, Kohima that we realised how to fight them, and that was to draw them into defensive area, let yourself actually be surrounded in a lot of cases, but also because their lines of communication were also stretched. There's a lot of air supply drops going in, and we realised they weren't the masters of the jungle. And if I'm right, John, I think the Japanese army was actually the sort of the poor relation to their navy and air force. And when you read stuff about it, tactically, apart from they were absolutely tenacious and fought to the death, but in the attack, they were not that tactically astute. I've just read a book about the Battle of the Admin Box when there's accounts of them coming up the same riverbed 4 or 5 times, treading over the bodies of their comrades.
Not going flanking, not trying to different.
No, they were certainly very tenacious, and indeed they were fearsome.
Yeah,
and what let them down, and it is something that shows up very much in Borneo, was their inability to administer and logistics.
Because they basically relied on capturing food and ammunition from their enemies, didn't they? There was no proper logistics chain.
They're a locust army. They're good in the advance because they eat the food that is there.
Yeah.
But once they're stopped, and Slim realised that, there's no food for them to eat, the logistics is not coming up. And the old statement, tactics can be done by anyone, but logistics has got to be done by the professionals. And actually, that holds very true indeed. In Java, where the fighting was, there's one battle there, the Battle of Kalijati Airfield, where 2 batteries were there. One from 6 heavy anti-aircraft. Their guns had to be destroyed in Sumatra, and they were acting as infantry. They were attacked on the 1st of March, and what occurred there, which I believe is probably the greatest number of air defence gunners dying around a single installation, the airfield, occurred. 103 members of the Royal Artillery perished there, either killed in action or executed straight afterwards. 29 out of 30 RAF and 43 Australian Air Force. Absolutely bloody. And one of the guys, I've listened to his voice, he described as firing his Bren gun, and it was like hitting cement. He said they just kept on coming on. And then he decided discretion was the better part of valor. Take the firing block and quietly bugger off. But no, it was absolutely, it's horrific. And that is in the book. On the 8th of March, the Dutch surrendered. And on the 9th, the British forces surrendered. And then they went into the first of the POW camp. And what occurred there, just to give a feeder, 200 British and Dutch soldiers decided to go up into the mountains and carry on guerrilla warfare. The Dutch were more adept at that. The British soldiers were not, and they were gunners. And they were rounded up very rapidly indeed, stuck into pig baskets, put in the back of trucks, driven around for people to see, and then taken out into the sea on back of trawlers and dumped overboard. A few judicious shots, they drowned or the sharks got them. In another instant, submarine, Dutch women and children were ordered on board on the decks. Submarine went out. They were told they were going to join a merchantman, which would take them to Singapore, you name it. Once out of sight of land, it then submerged. One Dutch woman survived because there happened to be a Javanese fisherman who watched it. That particular submarine commander was never brought to justice, And in one of the POW camps, the Dutch women had been passing food through the wire to the British POWs. And this was mainly fruit and things of that nature, with vitamin C is essential. And the new guard arrived with a scum out of the big Japanese cities in Formosa, grabbed these women, 8 of them, brought them into the camp, paraded all the POWs, and gang raped them in front of them. And reading the script of one of the POWs, RAF, who stood there and watched, he said he was crying and peeing in his pants, with the squadron leader walking backwards and forwards behind everyone, saying, "Steady, steady, remember this. Remember, I would have thought it would be scarred." And then the Java party was formed of gunners and of RAF. They moved to Singapore, Keppel Harbour, 17-mile walk to Changi. And people have this idea of Changi being a small area. It's not. It's 25 miles by 25 miles. It's vast, with various barracks inside. Of course, you've got Changi Jail. And Malaya Command greeted them, said, "Why aren't you marching properly? You're a disgusting shape." And they got nicknamed the Java Mob, which they thoroughly enjoyed. You know, if you nickname someone, "I'm a member of the Java Mob."
Badge of honour.
It was. A fortnight later, they got on board one of these hell ships with the Russell Party, and the Russell Party named after Lieutenant Colonel Russell, 1,000 odd, and they sailed for Kuching. Russell and his party disembarked there. Prior to disembarking, and this is all to do with fear, 30 prisoners, POWs, were taken off onto an island and executed. I think they probably were executed because the Japanese decided that they were the most unfit. Why keep them? Several had died on that voyage. And then the hell ship carried on round to Jesselton, today's Kota Kinabalu. And they arrived there and they went to Batu Tiga, which was the POW camp about 2 miles from the aerodrome, which is now today's international airport. They were there to build an aerodrome. 880 odd, 886. They went in, they arrived. The area was an acre. They had 4 buildings, enough to house half of them. The other half had to sleep out in the elements. It was on a slope. It was the local prison for 40 prisoners. Here they had 886. And the loo designed for 40 men. Well, you can imagine what happened. The loos filled up and raw sewage then rolled down. And it was only when it went past the guardhouse at the bottom that the Japanese said, "Oh yes, you can dig DTLs at the bottom." Over 450 went down with dysentery. And in the 6 months they were there, 51 died. And then in 2 parties, they were moved to Sandakan, to the British camp. And the Australian lot, which were B Force of 1,500, had already arrived previously, but they were separated.
So, John, I can hear the passion and your knowledge about the subject. Was that one of the things that drove you on and made you think that something had to be done about bringing this to a wider audience?
Yes, and indeed. And if one thinks of a triangle, one side was Sabah Salute. And what I wanted to do was to organise commemoration, remembrance, honour those gunners that died at Sandakan, Ranau, and on the death marches. And to do that, this was called Sabah Salute. And thankfully we got it going, and it occurred in 2011. And 13 gunners and 1 AGC from 205 battery, 105. So 14 boys and girls, major down to gunners. They after the Sandakan Day or VJ Day service, they then walked the 164-mile route, the Death March. They had to arrive up there by the 25th. In the meantime, I was sorting out the memorial service, which was an unveiling and dedication of the Royal Artillery Memorial at the Kundasang War Memorial, which is just outside of Ranau. They arrived on the 25th. On the 27th, we had our unveiling and dedication. And why the 27th? because 27th of August 1945, the last 15 POWs, 5 officers, 10 ORs, Australian and Brits, were executed at Ranna. And it was successful. We had 150 plus people attending. They'd come over from Western Australia and Sydney as well, from Perth, West Malaysia, from Sarawak, and of course within Sabah itself. The second bit was doing a roll of honour, and that was with all Australian and British POWs that perished in Sabah. The detail in there was 11 columns of detail, number, rank, name, to where they're buried, etc. That took a long time to get that detail. And that I then presented, to the Sabahan government, and that lies in the museum there. And I also presented it to the Royal Artillery at the Service of Remembrance at Hyde Park, formerly done. And that now lies in the church at Lark Hill in display there. And the third part of the triangle was the book.
So, John, what is your book about? If you could just give us a synopsis of your book.
It's in 5 parts. The first part is the raising of the regiment and moving to Southeast Asia. Part 2 is Borneo and the invasion of Borneo, the Japanese occupation, liberation of Borneo, and the Agus, Samet, and Oboe operations, and then Labuan and repatriation. It covers the history of Borneo, going back to the 1800s, because that actually was when the Japanese started looking at Borneo seriously indeed.
What was the strategic significance of Borneo to the Japanese?
2 items, oil and wood. Now, the oil, if we go, and this is actually rather pertinent of today, maybe, certainly with Iran, I believe, Japan was running riot in China. We've all heard of the Nanking massacres and the rape of, etc. What they were doing there was quite appalling. And America, ourselves, and the Dutch, all 3 of us said, we've got to somehow stop this. Sanctions. We'll stop the oil. Where was Japan getting her oil from? Palembang and Borneo, Sumatra and Borneo. And Borneo, 3, Suria in Brunei, Miri in Sarawak, and Tarakan in Dutch Borneo, was able to produce more than enough oil for the Japanese homeland and their war effort.
John, am I right in saying that Japan has no oil? That they can't produce oil in Japan, can they? There's no oil fields.
In essence.
Yeah.
So they had to get it. Lord Russell of Liverpool, in his book, said it gave Japan every reason and excuse to get down there and grab Borneo. And actually their big mistake was going and attacking Pearl Harbor. And of course there was wood. And Borneo is full of hardwood, which is can be used for all sorts of things. But that was the importance of it. But we didn't seem to take much notice of it. As an example, Sabah had no regular force at all. They had a few that were armed with First World War weaponry. Brunei had nothing. And Sarawak, yes, it had a force of about 1,000, but these were civilian. And funnily enough, 2nd 15 Punjab Regiment, who had gone there, A, to destroy the Miri Wells, and B, to defend Sarawak, a battalion of 1,000 men. And here's one of the most epic stories, which I write about. On the 25th of December, they start a fighting withdrawal for 800 miles through the Borneo jungle. And they come out at a place which I find unpronounceable, to be met by Japanese Marines who say, "We've got 24 hours to make up your mind, surrender, or we'll chase you down as terrorists." And the CO had no choice. He was out of ammunition. He was out of food. And the one supply of ammunition they had was Bren gun magazines with no ammunition in, grenades with the wrong primers, shambles. He lost half his men. actually over half. But it's an extraordinary story.
And mention that Punjabi regiment, and there's another aspect that's little known as well. It's a huge contribution from the Indian Army and some of the African Commonwealth countries as well. Well, they've been empire countries at the time, but there's a huge contribution by those countries in Burma as well. And obviously, what you're talking about, John, even this Punjabi regiment over in Sarawak area.
Indeed. The Dutch had their forces, the KNIL, a bit of fighting, and then they surrendered as well. But they were better equipped than what we were. And then the Japanese occupation, what I could refer to as the terrible years, which covers Jesselton, Sandakan, and Ranau. 30 British officers and two ORs, both RAF, were transferred to Kuching, to Batu Lintang, and 140 Australian officers. And basically what the Japanese had done was take out the command element, those that were back at Sandakan. And at Batu Lintang, which was the largest camp, up to over 4,000 POWs, internees, Australian, British, which was the largest amount, the Dutch, this is military, Indian POWs, and Javanese, and then there are the internees, men, women, and children. What I do describe in there is the food situation. One talks about malnutrition and things like that. The Japanese soldier and the Formosan guards had 800 grams of rice a day. Now, if you think of that, you go into the supermarket and it says, 50 grams is enough for a person. This is 800 grams. Initially, the POWs had 250. And then if anything happened at Sandakan, a bombing raid on the aerodrome, because they were there to build it, it was reduced. And so by the 1st of January, 1945, there was no rice. They were given no rice at all. And they were eating frogs, snails, worms, you name it. And shortly after that, the death marches started. This was very much the same at Batu Lintang, at Kuching, the same sort of thing. And then there's the maltreatment. And it's a standard sort of thing, the flying lessons of arms outside and with rocks. And if your arms dropped, you got beaten up. There was the cage, which basically is a pig basket. You couldn't stand, you couldn't sit. You were open to the elements. You could spend a day in there. One Australian, I think, Private Anier, he was in there for 4 months. You were brought out once a day and basically were beaten up before you were pushed back in again. The medics were doing their best, and when they passed them water, putting in some form of painkiller in there, if they had it. And in Kuching, they called it the dog kennel. Now, the cage at Sandakan was made all of bamboo. The dog kennels in Kuching were made of bamboo and barbed wire. The framework was bamboo. The floor, the sides, the ceiling was barbed wire. Absolutely shocking. And then, of course, there were the diseases. Everyone died of malaria, according to the Japanese. But there are all sorts of the other things. There's Java balls. There's happy feet, where at night time would come on, you had to go and walk around to this excruciating pain. And beriberi. And the best way I've always described it when I've given talks, and especially at schools. So go and find your father's Wellingtons and fill it up with water and then start walking. And you try walking 164 miles like that. Beriberi, your legs just fill up. One prison POW, the doctors took over 8 pints of water off him, and he still died. And there's wet beriberi and there's dry beriberi.
And that's vitamin deficiency, isn't it? Beriberi, is it vitamin D, I think?
It's, what is Marmite? D. Yeah.
Oh, vitamin B, yeah.
And that, if I was giving a talk to in public, I'd bring out my bottle of Marmite. And so that would have saved a lot of lives. They'd have a bit of meat for their food, which is the size of an OXO cube, once a week. Fish heads, which were generally rotting. Then I bring out the business. I hate the word, so sort of saying heroes, but the guys, the standout guys were the medics and the padres. Also do the locals. And in Sabah, once the locals knew I was writing, loads of them were coming forward. And so I had to select. Many of the stories were very, very similar. And they were shocking. A guide that I got to know, she was child number 13, baby number 13. But when the war started, father and mother had a 6-month-old baby. He was Chinese. She was Kadazan by tribal origin. He was captured by the Japanese and put into prison because he was Chinese. The mother, because she was married to Chinese, was contaminated. The Japanese loved that word, contaminated. And so she and her sister, with the young baby, disappeared up into the jungles. And there they lived for 3 years, going from cave to cave, eating flora, and they survived. And the mother came back. Husband amazingly survived, and she had another 12 children. That is one story. And then there's the massacres, the Double Tenth uprising in Sabah. The result of that was 5,000 locals being massacred, the massacres that were occurring. And in Kalimantan, or Dutch Borneo, at Mandor, the figure is between 2,000 and 20,000. And the Japanese in Kalimantan were inventing, it was plots, the Haga plot. Oh, this gives us an excuse to go and kill a lot of people. And so that sort of went on. And then in late 44, at Sandakan, 100 POWs, British POWs from Sandakan were moved to Labuan, and 200 were moved from Kuching. There were no survivors. They died at Labuan, Brunei town, which is now BSP, in Kuala Belait, and finally the final surviving lot were executed in Miri. There were no survivors, and they were all British POWs, Royal Artillery. And then its liberation. Well, prior to liberation, the Australians had this organisation, SRD. They provided Z-Force. They were a research department. And there was the Agus Party. And these guys initially they watched shipping going past. And they gathered intelligence. They built up an intelligence organisation. They then started training guerrillas. In British North Borneo, Sabah, they actually created 2 hospitals. And when the time came, they then started attacking the Japanese, and this tuned in with the Australian Oboe operations, the 3 Oboe operations.
I'm not familiar with the Oboe operations. Can you just give us a rough outline of what the Oboe operations were?
Yeah, they're amphibious operations. Oboe 6, which is, I consider the main one, was launched at Labuan and Brunei Bay. And then there's the one at Tarakan. And then there's the Oboe operation at Balikpapan. Both those 2 are in Kalimantan. But if I concentrate on Oboe 6, which was a massive operation involving air, sea and land. Having landed, the Japanese, they put up a good fight on Labuan Island. The Australians moved onto the mainland and pushed down the east coast of British North Borneo and then southwest down towards Brunei. And basically that was it, securing the main places. Everywhere the 3 places where they landed, it was hard fighting. And it's the first time the Australians have ever done amphibious operations, and they were highly successful.
Were any Japanese soldiers or officers held to account for their actions via war crimes trials?
Yeah, they were
war?
At Labuan and at Rabaul. And the key one was Lieutenant Colonel Sugar, who was the commandant of all POW camps in Borneo. he surrendered, was moved to Lab 1, and escaped the gallows or the firing squad by committing harry-carry with a bottle. His batman found a bottle and he killed himself. Others were tried, were either shot or hanged. One who's hanged, a nasty piece of work. He actually bit one of the guards as he was being taken up to the gallows. The warrant officer in charge of the Miri executions, he was brought to justice, but a lot got away. And then, of course, you had the San Francisco Agreement in 51, where all war crimes would cease. And shortly after that, the Japanese forgave them all, then released those that were doing life, etc. No prisoner, Japanese POW, did more than 10 years. And when the last prisoner left the prison in Tokyo, the bulldozers lined up and destroyed it. It's gone.
It's a strange thing that, though. The Japanese have never sort of, I think, was it in the 70s, you had the German Chancellor go to Paris and beg for forgiveness, more or less. But the Japanese have never admitted any wrongdoing for their part in the Second World War, have they? It seems to be a national thing that they just don't want to come to terms with.
They've said they've regret, isn't it? Regret, but they have never apologised, I don't believe.
Certain companies have apologised because they want to build a factory.
It's strange how the Japanese military and hierarchy were treated very differently to the Germans, who, if you were a guard at a concentration camp, we pursue them to the 80s and the 90s. We still pursue them.
But there was an element of that after the Second World War where they didn't pursue them at all because they basically brought them into the government and the civil service of Germany to help it run, didn't they?
And one of the horrific things about Oboe operations sent what they call the Kuching Force to Kuching to liberate Batu Lintang POW camp. And they arrived on the 11th of September. There was Sugar and his foul team handed over, etc. And they found in his paperwork, in his desk, and a briefcase of one of his officers, an order that internee women, children, and nuns were to be given poisoned rice for their breakfast. Internee men and Catholic fathers to be shot and burnt. 500 POWs to be marched to the mountains, then shot in the jungle, burnt and buried in pits. The sick and weak left at Batu Lintang to be burned to death. The entire Batu Lintang camp to be burnt, destroyed by fire. And that was going to occur, but the Australians arrived 4 days before it was going to occur. The war had already finished a month before.
Was this after the surrender of Japan?
15th of August. This was on the 15th of September that was going to occur. It's shocking. And then, of course, early 45 up in Ranau were the 3 death marches. The first march, 29% died on it. They were carrying goods. And there were nine groups. I've walked half of it, and that was from a place called Boto to Ranau, and I did that part because that was jungle. And today, the first part is all oil palm plantations, and so it bore no resemblance. And I wanted to get a feel, and we just crossed stream after stream after stream. In fact, I fell at one place and cracked 3 ribs, and here I was with proper clothing, boots, and all the rest of it. And fit, and these POWs were in a parlor state. And then the second group left, and both groups were given 4 days worth of rice. They were told on the 4th day they would get more rice. There wasn't, so they were having to eat whatever they could eat. And behind them came the killing squads. If you stopped, you were killed, bayoneted, bludgeoned, strangled, drowned. And at one place, 33 POWs were executed on that particular march. And at Paginantan, here's one of the most horrific things that occurred. Kempai and Tai, who were just down the river, came up on the boat.
These are the Japanese secret police, weren't they?
We want fresh meat. You. So they grabbed 2 prisoners, executed, and then butchered the meat, and then butchered the bodies for their fresh meat. Another delightful thing they were doing, grabbing a prisoner during the night and taking a strip off the leg where there's a bit of decent flesh, and that was a death warrant in itself. So it would give taste to their rice.
There's a lot made, John, of the sort of the Bushido code of the Japanese army, this whole warrior culture and ethos that they had. But from your research and what you've seen, that level of cruelty, was that just sadism, or did it tie into this code of Bushido? What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a strange thing. I suppose if you take Bushido to its original state, there is a code of chivalry in it. But then when the powers to be became Tojo, who became sort of the prime mover, this is the new Bushido. This is how we're going to behave. Prisoners, you must never be a prisoner. You fight to the death, and therefore, if you take a prisoner, they're not even worth what they are. So if they can't be of any use, get rid of them. So kill them, which is really quite a simple process. And one's got to say that they treated their own. The Japanese had their own death march. They shot their own who couldn't keep up because they were a liability. And so there was this extraordinary thing. I read a book written by a Japanese called The Bone Man of Kokoda, and he describes his being a recruit and how he was dehumanized. You're now in charge of this section. Give them orders. That wasn't good enough. He'd drag out his friend. Now hit him. And so he'd give a light tap. No, hit him properly. This is how you hit a person, with the slap. And he went flying. And his friend said, for heaven's sake, whack me one. So they ended up slapping each other. And here's the thing about slapping. You see it across the face. There are 2 ways, across the face or across the ear. And if you do it across the ear, you rupture the eardrum. Reading Weary Dunlop's book, he was an Australian iconic doctor in Java. And in his notes, I think it was something like 34 POWs with burst eardrums due to the slapping. And so this sort of beasting occurred, and so that is how you treat people. The second party death march group arrived at Ranau. They were greeted by 6 POWs, and they asked, where are the others? They're dead. They're exterminating us. And that 6 was 6 out of 454. And then the third group left, which were 70-odd. Majority were British POWs. They never got past mile 30, and they were executed along the route, leaving 218 or so behind in Sandakan. It's interesting, during my chats with people in FIPO and the organisation, oh yes, people talk about the crucifixion. We don't know where, but there's no paperwork, no nothing on it. Well, the crucifixion actually occurred at Sandakan, and it was the senior British officer, a captain, Royal Artillery, who he's a tall man, 6'6". Right at the end, he went and killed a pig, which was the Japanese had a little compound there, and they cooked it up, and he wanted it for his men. And the Japanese were beside themselves. Who did this? And he stood up and said, I did it for the welfare of my men. They stuck him in a cage for the night. The following day, they crucified him, then disemboweled, put a nail through his forehead. I won't go any further than that, but it's in the book. When that information came out by a local who said this had occurred, the Australian party that came along, they were the burial party, finding out information, etc. Oh, we don't believe that. And the guy said, yes, he's buried here, and eventually pointed, no, he's buried there. So they dug up and they found this 6'5", 6'6" person who had brick clothing on, nails through the feet, through the hands, disemboweled, and one through the forehead. And they said, the Japanese commit cannibalism. They had orders that they could do so if they were hungry, as long as it wasn't a Japanese.
When the prisoners all came back to the UK and back to Australia, why did the government silence them? We knew everything that was going on in Germany and Europe. Why was it silenced about the Far East?
The country was war weary. The war in VE Day had occurred. They'd beaten the Germans. The country was in a parlous state. Actually, people were not interested in this lot out there at all. And the POWs, if I go back to Lab 1, they were put into the Australian hospital, 24 field ambulance. And the Australians were absolutely fantastic. Good Aussie tucker is the only way to describe it. They filled up, put on weight. The doctors were all over them. In the book, there's an RAF officer who had X number of teeth extracted, and the dentist said, "How on earth did you survive with the pain?" And they said, "You just get used to it in the end." They had tea parties on the beach. They got tanned. They chatted amongst themselves. They couldn't chat to the Australians. And Hilda Bates, an SRN, she described, "We are amongst our barbed wire friends. I fear for when we go back." And she really hit it on the head. And so they sailed back, and they arrived, and actually there was no sort of bans and that sort of goings on. They signed this document. As I mentioned, you're not to talk to these people, but there is another bit in there. When you arrive back at a British port, you will be interrogated. What a word. Not interviewed. You will be interrogated. One of the things I quote, bits I quote, is this particular soldier. He was interrogated, and he said, "All right, you want to know the truth? I'll give you the truth. This officer, that warrant officer," and the person taking this, obviously bitter, nothing like that occurred. "No, I mentioned my uncle. He arrived at his parents' house in Bakewell, and he went up to the French windows, and his parents were sitting there. His father thought he'd never make it. His mother said, 'No, he's alive.' And there he was. They had no idea, no telegram, no nothing. There was no backup."
You mentioned, we discussed General Percival earlier, and you're saying that you felt that he's got a bit of a raw deal, and you've just mentioned no backup or help there. But can you just tell us a bit about General Percival and what he did after the war to help POWs from the Far East?
Yes, General Sir Archibald Percival. He retired in 1946. Very much a reviled man, because everyone cursed him for surrendering Singapore. Unfortunately, Churchill sort of led that attack. He was determined that he was going to do something for the former FIPOs and internees. He fought, and he got £5 million reparation from the Japanese. Now that is in 1946. Now I went onto the Bank of England sites and sort of put in what is £5 million in 1946 to what it is now. It's a massive amount. It's 200 and whatever it is million pounds. He fought their case until he died 10 years later, publicly and behind the scenes. Basically got hold of the FIPO organisation. The government was saying, well, if you want to set up something like that, do it in your own local area. Roehampton Hospital was the FIPO hospital, but then it was made into an NHS hospital. And so we're not interested in FIPOs. These guys were suffering from all sorts of things, diseases, mentally. And Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine then said, we will take on that mantle. And my word, they did. Looked after them. Man or woman could go to them. They'd look after them physically, you name it, because a lot of the diseases people were getting out there remain in the body, like dysentery. Malaria can come back viciously, and so forth. And of course, there's the aspect of of the mental side, or PTSD. I'm afraid it's a thing that gets bandied around too easily by the non-military, probably being non-PC there. But there was humour. There was good black humour. And one instance is he was an internee at Batu Lintang, and he worked in the hospital. He was an estate manager who had a name for himself as being a bit of a jungle doctor, using various things. And this Japanese soldier came up and said, "Please, can you sort me out?" And he said, "What?" And so he dropped his trousers. I said, "There I saw this disgusting-looking thing hanging down." And said, "All right, yes, okay, I can, but you've got to bring me get a bottle of sake." So I went and got a sake and said, "In that, you stuff it full of chilies. Can you get chilies?" "Yes." "Right, bring it back when you show them." So I said, "Look, there are all these chilies. What do I do now?" "Leave it in the sun for about a week. And don't open it, just leave it then," because what it was doing was fermenting. "And then you've got to drink it all." He said, I never saw him again.
So, John, what's the story behind the stunning photo used on the book cover?
Well, I took that photograph when I was doing my recce for Sabah Salute, and it was in 2010, either the 16th or 17th of August. Sabah Tourism, which is a government department, had given me a driver and vehicle, and in the back I actually had two sons of FIPOs. We drove the basic route of the Death March route. And this particular part, and I was taking photographs with my digital camera, and this particular part, which is a road, a dirt track now, was actually a single man or pony track, or rentis as they call them. And in the distance is Ranau. And I drove over, just click, click, and we carried on down the track. When I got back to Lark Hill, 3 weeks later, I was going through my several hundred photographs to create a PowerPoint to go and brief the director, flicked past this, and then went back and just stared at it. I said, I don't believe this. I got up and walked around, came back, sat down, and said, it's a reflection. It's a reflection of the tile on the vehicle, which was used to protect the dashboard. But it was stunning in itself.
So had this tile made the appearance of figures, ghostly figures on the actual photograph? Yes. Is that how it worked?
And what it amounted to was the reflection was being thrown up onto the windscreen. And I had it made into a picture which I actually presented to Sabah Tourism and another one to the Kundasang War Memorial. But prior to presenting the picture, I met with the driver and guide and said, look at that. And he said, yeah, it's a reflection from my towel. But John, there are 3 things wrong with it. I said, what's that? My towel has only got 6 figures on it, the 6 that escaped. I don't want the ones that have died. And if you count up, depending on the size of the picture, there's either 14 or 20, or in fact, you can get 24. The second thing is, the way I have my towel is that your figures should be upside down, walking on their heads. Mm. And thirdly, on the right-hand side of it, which I pointed out at the beginning, there is this figurine of either a Japanese or a Formosan guard with his rifle and a pig sticker on it. That is not there. There is nothing like that at all. And he said, that is really very, very odd. And I thought, that is it. This was in my office. That kept me going in many ways in researching and writing. And that is the story behind it.
And what I'll do, John, is you've very kindly supplied me with a photograph of the book cover, and I'll put that up in our social media accounts. And the links for that will be in the show notes. So if anybody wants to track them down, the picture that John's referring to, you'll be able to see it there. John, how can listeners get a hold of a copy of the book?
Well, that is through me. I'm the only distributor here in the UK or the publisher out in KK. The book itself is 492 pages. It does have maps and it has photographs. It weighs 1.5 kilograms. So it's not one you can sort of read in bed above your head type of thing. My email address is John Tulloch 4145 gmail.com.
And again, I'll put that in the show notes, John, so people can just click on the show notes and you'll be able to get John's email
John
from
Tulloch,
that.
4145 at gmail.com. The book itself is £25, plus P&P, which is a further £4.87.
That's great, John. Thank you very much for that. So, and thanks for coming on the podcast, John. It's been really, really interesting. You've certainly fired my interest up in another unknown aspect of the campaign in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I've read a lot of books about the Far East, but I didn't know any of this.
That's it for another podcast, and our thanks to John for coming on and telling us about his book, and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming in, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. And as I've already said, John's email and how to get in touch with him to get a copy of his book will also be there. And if anyone wants to get in touch, you can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you've downloaded us from iTunes or Spotify and like the podcast, it'd be great if you leave us a review there, as these two platforms are where the majority of our downloads come from. Thanks also to Nick Beale for offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.